I almost didn't go to my sister's engagement dinner, and looking back now, that probably would have saved me a lot of humiliation, but at the time I let myself believe that the invitation meant something. Maybe it meant she was finally ready to move past whatever had always existed between us, that quiet tension no one ever talked about but everyone seemed to feel. My mom had called me a couple of days before and said it would mean a lot if I came because this was important for my sister and because family shows up for moments like this, and I knew that really meant she wanted things to look normal. We hadn't been close in years, and even when we still spoke, it always felt careful, like one wrong sentence could turn everything sideways, but I still let myself hope that maybe this was a chance to reset something. I bought a real gift, not something last minute, and I took time getting ready because I didn't want to show up looking like I didn't care. On the drive there, I kept telling myself to stay calm, to stay open, and not to expect anything bad before it actually happened. The restaurant was already full when I arrived, one of those places with dim lighting and that polished, quiet energy where everything looks intentional. The hostess led me to a long table in the back where everyone was already sitting, laughing, taking pictures, fully settled into the evening like it had started a while ago. I saw my mom first, then my sister in the center, glowing in that way people do when all the attention is exactly where they want it, with her fiancé right beside her, arm resting behind her chair like the whole scene had been planned down to the smallest detail. I stood there for a second with the gift in my hands, waiting for something that felt like a real welcome. My mom smiled at me, but it looked more relieved than happy, and my sister glanced up with an expression that wasn't surprise so much as discomfort, like my presence had complicated something she thought she had under control. Then I looked at the table more carefully and realized there was no seat for me anywhere near my family. Every place was set, with name cards and arranged seating that clearly wasn't random. My mom sat close to my sister, her fiancé's parents were across from them, and even distant friends and people I didn't recognize had assigned spots. The only open seat was at the far end of the table, placed between three of my sister's friends I had never met, far enough away that I wouldn't naturally be part of any conversation with my own family. For a second, I thought maybe something had been moved or that another chair was coming, because it felt too deliberate to be a mistake. But before I could ask, my sister gave me a small, tight smile and pointed toward that empty seat. "Oh, good, you made it," she said, her tone polite in a way that felt more for the room than for me. "You can sit there. I figured you'd be more comfortable with the younger crowd." The younger crowd didn't look particularly comfortable with me. One girl glanced at me quickly and then looked away, another shifted her chair just enough to make space without actually acknowledging me, and no one smiled in a way that felt genuine. It wasn't openly rude, which somehow made it worse, because everything about it felt intentional without being obvious enough to call out. I placed the gift beside my sister's chair and leaned in just enough to say congratulations, keeping my voice steady, because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react that quickly, and she thanked me without even looking at the box. Then I walked to the end of the table and sat where I had been placed, suddenly aware of how far away my family could feel while sitting in the same room. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the seating was complicated. Maybe her fiancé had arranged it. Maybe there was some harmless explanation that only felt personal because I was the one sitting there. But that idea started falling apart almost immediately. The conversation around me was already closed, built on shared trips, inside jokes, and stories I wasn't part of. And while no one was openly unkind, no one made any real effort to include me either. It felt less like joining a dinner and more like being placed in the background of someone else's evening. When the server came by to ask if we needed menus, everyone else already had one. Mine was the only place missing it. He apologized and handed it to me, but by then that quiet, familiar feeling had already settled in, the one where the situation isn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but just uncomfortable enough that you know exactly what it is. So I smiled when I had to, answered when someone spoke to me, and tried to act like I didn't notice how carefully everything had been arranged to keep me exactly where I was. At some point, I realized I wasn't even trying to follow the conversation anymore. I was just sitting there, nodding at the right moments, pretending I belonged in a space that had already decided I didn't. The people around me kept talking over each other, laughing too loudly at stories that didn't need that kind of reaction, and every now and then someone would ask me a polite, surface-level question before immediately turning back to someone more relevant. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't confrontational, but it was clear enough that I had been placed there on purpose, like an afterthought that still needed to be accounted for. I tried to focus on small things instead of letting it get to me, the way the glasses caught the light, the sound of cutlery against plates, the rhythm of the room, anything that made it feel less personal, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became to ignore the distance between me and the rest of the table. Every time I glanced down toward where my family was sitting, I saw my sister leaning into conversations, smiling easily, completely at home in a night that didn't seem to include me in any meaningful way. After a while, I excused myself, partly because I needed a break and partly because I didn't trust myself to keep sitting there without reacting. I walked toward the hallway where the restrooms were, letting the noise of the dining area fade just enough to think clearly again. I stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection, trying to decide if I was overreacting or if this really was exactly what it felt like. That's when I heard her. I placed the gift beside my sister's chair and leaned in just enough to say congratulations, keeping my voice steady, because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react that quickly, and she thanked me without even looking at the box. Then I walked to the end of the table and sat where I had been placed, suddenly aware of how far away my family could feel while sitting in the same room. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the seating was complicated. Maybe her fiancé had arranged it. Maybe there was some harmless explanation that only felt personal because I was the one sitting there. But that idea started falling apart almost immediately. The conversation around me was already closed, built on shared trips, inside jokes, and stories I wasn't part of. And while no one was openly unkind, no one made any real effort to include me either. It felt less like joining a dinner and more like being placed in the background of someone else's evening. When the server came by to ask if we needed menus, everyone else already had one. Mine was the only place missing it. He apologized and handed it to me. But by then that quiet, familiar feeling had already settled in. The one where the situation isn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but just uncomfortable enough that you know exactly what it is. For a second, I thought about walking back in and saying something right then, calling her out in front of everyone, forcing her to own what she had just said, but the image of that played out in my head too quickly. I could already see how it would go. I would look emotional, she would look calm, and somehow I would still end up being the problem. So instead, I stayed there for another moment, letting the reality of it settle in fully, and then I walked back to the table like nothing had changed, even though everything had. When I sat down again, the conversation around me hadn't shifted at all. No one asked where I had been, no one seemed to notice the difference, and for the first time that night I stopped trying to fit into it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't try to add anything. I didn't pretend I was enjoying myself. I just observed, quietly, as the evening moved forward exactly the way she had predicted it would. And that was the moment something in me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt final. Because I understood now that this wasn't about fixing anything between us. It never had been. By the time the plates started getting cleared, I had already checked out of the evening emotionally, even though I was still sitting there, still nodding when someone glanced in my direction, still playing along just enough not to draw attention. It was almost automatic at that point, like my body knew how to stay in situations my mind had already decided to leave. Dessert came and went, more photos were taken, glasses were raised again, and at some point someone made a joke about how expensive the place was, which made everyone laugh in that slightly performative way people do when money isn't actually a problem for them. I didn't laugh. I just sat there, watching it all like I was already outside of it. Then the check came. The server placed it near my sister, naturally, because she had positioned herself as the center of the entire evening, and for a second everything felt normal again, like this was the part where she and her fiancé would handle it, where the night would wrap up cleanly and everyone would leave with that polished, curated memory of a perfect engagement dinner. She opened it, glanced down, and then looked up with a smile. "We've got it," she said lightly. "Don't worry, we're covering everyone." There was an immediate reaction around the table, people thanking her, smiling, raising their glasses again, and for a brief second I almost believed I had misread everything, that maybe this was her way of smoothing things over, of including me without making a big deal out of it. Then she turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. "Except you, obviously," she added, just as casually. The words landed quietly, almost softly, but they carried across the table in a way that made a few people glance between us, unsure if they had heard that correctly. "You weren't really part of the dinner," she continued, her tone still light, still controlled, like she was explaining something completely reasonable. "So, it makes more sense if you just cover your own." For a moment, no one said anything, and the silence felt heavier than anything she had actually said out loud, like everyone at the table understood exactly what was happening but had already decided not to get involved. One of the girls sitting near me let out a small, awkward laugh, like she wasn't sure if this was a joke or something she was supposed to ignore, while someone else picked up their glass just to have something to do with their hands. I noticed her fiancé shift slightly in his seat, his expression tightening for a second like he was about to say something, but then he didn't, and that hesitation somehow made it worse. My mother looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes completely, and that was the moment it stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling final. I looked down at the check when it was slid toward me, and the number was higher than it should have been because even though I had barely ordered anything, it was clear I was paying for more than just my part. When the receipt came back, I signed it without hesitation, folded it neatly, and placed it back on the tray like this was just another normal part of the evening. Then I stood up. "I should get going," I said, my voice steady, neutral enough that no one could quite read what was behind it. My sister nodded, already half turned towards someone else, like my leaving was expected, like it had been part of the plan from the beginning. That more than anything confirmed it. She had known exactly how this would end. And for the first time that night, I realized I was about to do something she hadn't planned for at all. Before I walked away from the table, I reached for the gift I had placed beside my sister earlier that night, the one she hadn't even looked at, and held it in my hands for a second longer than necessary, as if I was deciding whether it still belonged to her at all. Then I turned back just enough to place it directly in front of her. "I think you should open it later," I said, keeping my tone calm, almost detached, like this was just another polite gesture at the end of the evening. She barely glanced at it. Okay, she replied, distracted, already shifting her attention back to the people around her, to the conversation, to the version of the night she actually cared about. For a moment, I stood there looking at her, at how easily she dismissed me even now, and I realized something that felt strangely grounding. She had already decided who I was in her story. There was nothing I could say in that moment that would change it. So I didn't try. I picked up my bag, turned, and walked away from the table without waiting for anyone to stop me, because I already knew no one would. The sound of voices and laughter filled the space behind me again almost immediately, like my presence had never really been part of it in the first place. Outside, the air felt colder than I expected, sharp enough to clear my head, and for the first time that night, I let myself breathe without forcing it to stay steady. I had imagined that leaving would feel heavier, like I was losing something, but instead it felt strangely quiet, like something that had been stretched for too long had finally been released. And the truth was, I had already said everything that needed to be said, just not out loud. Inside the box, beneath the neatly wrapped paper and the gift she hadn't bothered to acknowledge, there was a letter. Not long, not dramatic, not written to impress anyone, just honest in a way I had never allowed myself to be with her before. I told her that the distance between us hadn't started the way she thought it did, and that I hadn't walked away because I didn't care, but because I already knew how the story would end if I stayed. I reminded her of him, someone she had trusted without ever questioning, someone she defended even when other people didn't, and then I told her the part she never knew. That he didn't just cross a line with me, he pushed until there was no space left to ignore it, and when I didn't give him what he wanted, he made it very clear what would happen next. He told me that if I didn't agree to see him, he would make sure you heard a different version of the story, one where I was the problem, one where I tried to come between you. And I believed him, not because I trusted him, but because I knew you would. I knew that if it came down to his word against mine, you wouldn't choose me, because you never really did. So I left before I could become the villain in your version of the story. Not because I didn't care about you, but because I cared enough to protect you from something you would never have questioned. And tonight just proved that I was right. And then I ended it simply. That tonight made it clear that none of it had mattered. That the version of me she had chosen to believe in all those years ago had never really changed. And that this time, I wasn't walking away to protect her. I was walking away because there was nothing left worth staying for. As I walked down the street, away from the restaurant, away from the noise, away from the version of family that had never quite included me the way it was supposed to, I realized that I didn't feel angry the way I thought I would. I didn't feel like I needed to go back and explain myself, or fix anything, or wait for her to understand. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself, or go back, or wait for her to finally understand something she had already decided not to see. I had shown up. I had tried. And now I was choosing to leave without asking for anything in return. I don't know what happened after she opened that letter. I don't know if she believed me, or if she just added it to whatever version of me she's been holding on to all these years. But I do know one thing. This time, I didn't walk away to protect her. I walked away because I finally chose myself. If you were in my place, would you have stood up and said everything out loud? Or would you have walked away like I did? If stories like this hit you, subscribe.